Mbukeli indzaba yemkhuhlane i-COVID-19 indzaba lesolo sichubekane kuyikhulumisa singumsakado edithombe ekhaya Eswatini. Namhla mbukeli sifuna kubuka ngidawusho ukuthi indzaba yemkhuhlane ndawusho ukuthi umkhuhlane nje mbukeli ngifuna ukuthi indzaba yemjovo i-AstraZeneca lekungumjovo lesingasho ukuthi silive kumbe sike saveta lokuthi vele sesiwutfolile lo mjovo ukuthi utaba khona even kwaphindze kwaba nesigaba lapho khona kube ngazuthi akusavakali kahle hle kodwa nje ngethemba lokuthi mbukeli sisafuna lokuthi lo mjovo sibheke phi nawo namuhla kumbe siwafundzele emaphephandzaba ikhuluma induna itiko letempilo ukuthi cha sitawuchubeka nawo lo mjovo ngithi ke mbukeli la elihlelweni lakho i-COVID-19 special coverage ngingiJohn Molele ke ngase ngulethele i-perspective ke mbukeli sitayitfola ngokuthi kumbe siconze lokuthi lo mjovo vele nasikhuluma ngawo kungilomuhla sigaba sawo bathini kumbe betempilo sithatha kumbe ku the highest body le kuyi World Health Organization ngifuna ke mbukeli sihambe nawe siyongena ngekhathi eholeni ka WHO base Geneva lapho bakhuluma khona lendzaba lengisho ukuthi ithinza wona lo mjovo we-AstraZeneca kunginyalo nje mbukeli sitawela nawe ngethemba ukuthi sovele usigadzile Fadila over to you.
Good afternoon. This is Fadila Shaib speaking to you from WHO headquarters in Geneva and welcoming you to the WHO press conference. Today, we will brief you about the WHO Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization, known as SAGE, who met this Monday, and today we will present you its interim recommendation on the use of AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID-19. Welcome all. Joining us from Mexico is Dr. Alejandro Cravioto, who is the chair of the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts on Immunization. In Geneva and in the room are Dr. Joachim Hambach, who is the Executive Secretary for SAGE, Dr. Kate O'Brien, Director, Department of Immunization, Vaccines and Biologicals, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, WHO Chief Scientist. I would like to inform you that this press conference will be held in English only today. Welcome all. I would like now to hand over to Dr. Swaminathan to make some opening remarks. She will be followed by Dr. Cravioto. Dr. Swaminathan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's online. I'm Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. I'm the Chief Scientist of the World Health Organization. And what we'd like to do today is to really present to you the recommendations from SAGE. SAGE is a strategic advisory group of experts on immunization. This is a body that's existed now for about 22 years. It was created in order to inform and develop evidence-based guidelines for immunization. And it has, over the years, developed into a very well-respected body whose recommendations are used globally. Now, obviously, at this time, there is a lot of attention on COVID vaccines, and the SAGE has so far made recommendations on the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. Today, we'll talk to you about the recommendations for use of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And in the coming weeks, you will see more recommendations coming out as we review the evidence from the different candidates. The SAGE working group on COVID vaccines has a very busy agenda, and in the next couple of weeks, they're going to invite the developers of different vaccine candidates from all over the world to come and present the data to them. Even if it's ongoing studies, they want to be updated on a regular basis, and this allows the SAGE and the WHO to make recommendations in a timely manner. We're also trying to work in parallel on the regulatory side, which is the emergency use listing, the pre-qualification process. So there are two sets of activities, independent but coordinated, to ensure that not only do we have the policy guidance coming out for vaccines, but at the same time, we also have the regulatory work being done and the emergency use listing hopefully happening around the same time, so that countries can very quickly start the rollout of the vaccine. Now, as of today, we know that over 130 million doses of vaccines have been given to people around the world. Many countries have started vaccination programs, but we do see an imbalance between high-income countries and low and low-middle-income countries. And so these guidelines that are being released today are very, very important, because the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine is one of the main vaccines at this point in the COVAX facility. It's going to be procured in hundreds of millions of doses and distributed around the world. And so many countries will be receiving their first tranches of the vaccine from the COVAX facility later in February. So this is an important milestone, and we hope that this will be followed very soon by the recommendation on the emergency use listing of this product, which, of course, apart from safety and efficacy, also looks at the manufacturing quality and the manufacturing processes. So there are some additional criteria that are looked at before a vaccine is listed for emergency use. So I think it's an important day, because it really, this is one of those vaccines which can be stored in ordinary refrigerated temperatures, and therefore it's going to be very useful for a large number of countries with different situations on the ground. So logistically, it's easier to use. And we will hear now the recommendations from the chair of SAGE, Professor Alejandro Cravioto, and then we have in the room Dr. Kate O'Brien and Dr. Joachim Hombach, and we can then open it up for questions and answers. And finally, I'd like to say that I'm sure there will be many questions on this, but this is, I think, of greater interest, this particular vaccine candidate, because of the recent data that we've seen coming out of a small study in South Africa that has raised some concerns about the use of this vaccine. So we're going to address the variants issue as well. This is something that we've spoken about in WHO, and what are the systems we're putting in place to monitor variants and make sure that we have a globally coordinated system to not only do the surveillance and collect the data and look at the evidence, but also then translate it into what happens with the vaccines. So we can talk more about that later as well. So I'd like to turn it back to you, the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. Dr. Cravioto, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good evening. As Dr. Swaminathan said, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts was established by the Director General of the World Health Organization in 1999 as the principal advisory group to provide independent advice to the DG on vaccines and immunization. And for the purpose of the COVID-19 vaccines, we have set up since June of last year a group of 26 experts who have been considering all aspects that would inform policy recommendations, including values, ethics, clinical trials, and programmatic considerations. We have undertaken a three-step process for the guidance for overall COVID-19 vaccination. And this includes a values framework for the allocation and prioritization that was issued in September of last year, a WHO prioritization roadmap identifying priority groups for vaccination that was issued in October of last year, and finally, two specific recommendations for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine that have been previously made public. In the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, we had a long review of the evidence, talked to the experts and the people who are directly involved with the trials, and we have come out with the following recommendations. Based on the current evidence, SAGE recommends that this vaccine should be administered in 2 doses of 0.5 milliliter each, with an interval of between 4 and 12 weeks between the first and the second dose. And given the evidence that we saw, we realized that extending the evidence between 8 and 12 weeks is the best time really to give a second dose to produce a much better immune response. So our recommendation is to use these 8 to 12 weeks interval as the main one for the application of this vaccine. In the case of the data coming from clinical trials, we have seen that there was a small participation of people over 65 years of age. However, the results of the efficacy estimate for persons up to 65 and older had a wide confidence interval, and therefore we feel that the response of this group cannot be any different to groups that are of a younger age. So we therefore, since we have identified people over 65 as one of our priority groups in the prioritization roadmap, we have based a totality of looking at the safety and the immunogenicity data, and therefore we recommend for the vaccine to be used in people 18 years and above without an upper age limit. That means people over 65 years of age should be given the vaccination. We have two groups that we look in particular. One is the pregnant women, and here, although the vaccine is safe, we don't have enough information to make a general recommendation about its use in pregnant women. However, if a woman is at risk or belongs to one of the high-risk risk groups, or is at a risk because of comorbidities, and the woman is pregnant, we therefore see no reason why she should not be vaccinated under the guidance of the clinical practitioner that she uses for advice. That would be the same issue with women who are breastfeeding, for which we still don't have full information, but if they belong to one of these risk groups, and here we refer mainly to women who are involved in activities that put them at risk of being infected with COVID, for example, are health workers, then they should be vaccinated as well. We recommend that regardless of the person's history of whether they have had a COVID infection or not, they should also be a part of the vaccination program. We have no information to really assess how much an infection will produce a lasting immunity, and therefore we feel that it is appropriate to recommend that anybody who has had contact or not with the SARS-CoV-2 virus should get the 2 doses of the vaccine as recommended before. And we also advise governments to look at, in their own countries, of which to prioritize the group that they feel are the most disadvantaged or that have the highest rates of the possibility of getting infected and being seriously ill or dying for the start of the vaccination and the use of these products now that we have a constraint in the supply chain. We still don't recommend any of these vaccines for international travelers. We don't have enough vaccines to be able to cover that, and we don't feel that this is a group that, first of all, should be traveling unnecessarily, and second, that would require the specific protection of a vaccine. This will probably come later when the supply chain is appropriate, and also when we have other factors related to how much that will really help us to curb disease. Now, because of what Dr. Soumya was alluding to, which is the circulation of these variants that has worried everybody in the past weeks, we did look at 2 aspects of the circulation of the variants in relation to the AstraZeneca vaccine. In the trial in the United Kingdom, a preliminary analysis has shown a slightly reduced vaccine effectiveness of this AstraZeneca vaccine against the SARS-CoV-2 variant that is circulating there that we call B.1.117, and only a limited reduction in the titers of neutralization, meaning that the vaccine is still having a good effect in protecting people infected with this variant. In the case of South Africa, where the variant that is circulating is called B.1.351, the preliminary analysis using antiserum obtained from people infected or vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine has shown that there is a marked reduction in the vaccine effectiveness against mild or moderate disease, and a reduction in the neutralizing antibody levels. This study was designed to assess efficacy against disease of any severity, but the small sample size did not allow the assessment of vaccine efficacy against severe infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And there is indirect evidence that is compatible that there is still a protection against this severe disease using the AstraZeneca vaccine. Considering all these factors, we have made the recommendation that even if there is a reduction in the possibility of this vaccine having a full impact in its protection capacity, especially against severe disease, there is no reason not to recommend its use, even in countries that have the circulation of the variants. I will repeat that. Even if you have the circulation of a variant in a country, there is no reason that we see for now to use this AstraZeneca vaccine as indicated to be able to reduce the level of severe disease in that population. We also feel, as a final note, that there is a need to have a very strong and robust follow-up of the use of these vaccines as they are implemented in any country. The pharmacovigilance to assess its long-term safety and the impact these vaccines might have in the possibility of containing the infection are two things that are very important for us to follow up, and those will be the things that will define eventually how we have a final use for these products. We will be looking, as Dr. Swaminathan said, at other vaccines in the very near future, and we will come up with the recommendations for their use as well. I would leave it at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cravioto. I would like now to open the floor to questions from the press, just reminding you that you will need to raise your hand. I will start with Sophie Mokoena from South Africa, working for SABC, South African Television. Sophie, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Fadila. My question is around South Africa in particular. The country has already bought 1 million doses. They arrived last week. There was hope and optimism, particularly from the frontline workers who are vulnerable and also ordinary people. And now there was this information, and there's now confusion whether South Africa should continue with the vaccination using the available vaccine, even though you have this problem of the variant 501YV2. What is your recommendation as a panel? What must South Africa do? Must South Africa continue administering these vaccines, the vaccine that is available now? Or should South Africa not use it? Or are we are we going to be compelled perhaps to look at maybe boosting the vaccine? What is your recommendation? What must South Africa do, and what must the South African public take into consideration?
Thank you, Sophie. Your question is very well understood, and I will ask Dr. O'Brien to respond to it. Thank you, Sophie.
Yes, this question is really top of mind for people, and let me do my best to answer in as clear a way and pointing to the evidence as possible and the recommendations. I think the first thing to say is that as WHO, we have been in conversations with experts and ministry officials in South Africa. So we are conferring, providing all advice possible and in close discussions about the way forward. The important thing to remember is that the AstraZeneca vaccine is an efficacious vaccine. It has demonstrated efficacy and safety, and it is an important vaccine for the world, given the short supply that we have on vaccines. And in taking all of the evidence under advisement, this very recent evidence about this small trial that is inconclusive around its findings, albeit demonstrating a low efficacy against mild and moderate disease with no evidence to point in one direction or another on severe disease. So we have an absence of evidence from that trial about whether or not the AZ product has efficacy against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And that is the outcome of most interest and most impact for early rollout of vaccines. We do have SAGE having reviewed all of the evidence, and this evidence was presented to SAGE on Monday afternoon, along with the evidence on variants of other types, the B117 variant as well. And we do have an assessment from SAGE that there is a plausible expectation that the vaccine will have efficacy against severe disease, albeit we don't have the evidence in hand, but there's plausibility for that being the case. And the reason that there's plausibility, it really comes from 3 lines of evidence. The first is that for all of the vaccines, there is a gradient of response going from the highest response is against the most severe disease, and then somewhat lower efficacy for moderate, and then further down for mild disease. And we're starting to get evidence on the impact against infection, regardless of whether you have disease or not. So we know that there's a gradient, as is true of many vaccines. This is not unique to coronavirus vaccine. So given only evidence on mild and moderate disease, we would expect that whatever the efficacy is, it would be higher against severe disease than mild and moderate. The second line of evidence is that we know from other of the coronavirus vaccines that the correlation between the neutralizing activity and efficacy is not a one-to-one correlation. And so we are expecting more data to come in on the neutralization activity of other products that have shown efficacy against moderate and severe disease against this variant. And the third line of evidence is on the T-cell responses. And remember that there are different ways that the immune system responds to vaccines. One is by producing antibodies, but another component of the immune system are the T-cells. And the evidence that was presented to SAGE provided a view that the maintenance of the T-cell response would be quite strong against this variant. So it's really the guidance that SAGE is coming with is to recognize that we have limitations of the data around exactly what to expect with this vaccine relative to severe disease, hospitalization, and death. but in its full nature, the advice from SAGE and taken on board now by WHO is to proceed with the vaccine, even in the setting of variants, with countries taking into consideration their own specific epidemiologic situation, the access that they have to a variety of different products, and to tailor that decision-making for each country. The intention, as we understand it from South Africa, is to proceed with the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine in the context of collecting, in a very dedicated way and a well-designed way, collecting the kind of information that is needed in order to fill in some of the gaps in information around severe disease for this product with the variant that is circulating. And we will be doing everything possible to support South Africa in any way we can around the design of the evaluations of the vaccine. So the pause that has been put in place to allow time in order to design what those evaluations will look like is an important pause so that they can be best designed to get the kind of evidence that would allow an ongoing review of the vaccine and the way it's being deployed in different countries and different settings around the world. So that's the reasoning behind the recommendation from SAGE and that recommendation to WHO, which has been accepted, and the advice, generally speaking, to countries about how to address the use of the vaccine and the variants. So let me stop there and just see if either of my colleagues, Dr. Hambach or Dr. Swaminathan, want to add anything further to that.
Very quickly, just to say that, just to re-emphasize that the decision in South Africa is to roll it out, but in a way that you're collecting evidence and data so that that can inform the future rollout. So some of the headlines we saw in the media were, that they're going to stop using this vaccine. That's not accurate. And so I think the way that, Kate just explained it, it's a phased rollout of the vaccine. The other quick point is that some countries have, a choice of multiple vaccines that they have already purchased, and in those situations, countries can actually make decisions, because from what we know of these different vaccine candidates, you could use them for one subpopulation or another. But the vast majority of countries that are still waiting to introduce a vaccine, and this vaccine may be the first one, it's certainly the benefits, will far outweigh the risks. And the last point I want to make is that the detection of the variant in a country does not mean that that is the predominant circulating strain. So unless there is good genomic data from a country, South Africa has a significant amount of genomic surveillance. So they've been able to track over time the displacement of the previous variant with the new variant, the 501V2, and which now constitutes 90% of circulating strains. But in many other countries, the situation may be that with very limited sequencing, we've been able to detect this variant, but we don't know the spread. And therefore, we have to be very cautious in making decisions based on very limited data. And I think one of the messages clearly is the need for improving genomic surveillance and initiatives like the African Pathogen Disease Initiative that the Africa CDC and Africa WHO are doing jointly to expand genomic surveillance across the continent is going to be very important in the coming days.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. I would like now to invite Christian Ulrich from German news agency DPA to ask the next question. Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Fadela. This is also a question on AstraZeneca. Are you not afraid that people who will be vaccinated with this vaccine that might not be as efficient as others, that they would feel a false sense of security and let down all the other measures and might, in that case, make the situation worse than it is at the moment?
Thank you. Dr. O'Brien.
This is an extremely important point, not only for any particular vaccine, but for the entirety of the vaccine program that is rolling out worldwide in countries everywhere around the world. The issue of whether or not a person who has been vaccinated can take their foot off the pedal and stop using a mask, stop all the other interventions that we've been communicating for the whole of the pandemic, hand washing, now physical distancing, avoiding congregating in large groups of people. Those interventions need to continue for individuals who have been vaccinated and for communities of people as the vaccine is rolling out. And the reason for that is several-fold. The first is that we have evidence on whether or not these vaccines and the magnitude of how much they protect against disease. That is what the efficacy trials were designed to do, and these are the efficacy results that have been so widely communicated and I think are being well understood by people in countries around the world. What we don't know about these vaccines is the degree to which they protect against becoming infected. And as we all know, you can be infected and have no symptoms. Either you're before the development of your symptoms, or in some people, they become infected and don't develop symptoms at all. And yet any of those people can transmit the infection to somebody else. So until we have the evidence from the studies, and they were designed into the studies, but we don't have the results of those data yet, we are recommending very strongly that people maintain all other interventions, masking, hand washing, avoidance of a lot of contact with other people. Because for several reasons. First of all, no vaccine is 100% protective in 100% of people who receive the vaccine. We've seen that the efficacy results are very strong, especially for hospitalization and death, but none of them are 100% effective against all elements of disease. So even if you are vaccinated, you still have some risk of developing disease, even if it may be of a more mild form. And you certainly are at risk of still becoming infected, whether you know it or not, and transmitting it to somebody else. So for these reasons, not for any particular vaccine, but frankly for all of the vaccines that now have evidence around their efficacy, being vaccinated is not a reason to stop doing all of those things. In fact, it's ever more important that everybody is undertaking the interventions with ever greater intensity. And the reason I say that is as we roll out these vaccines, they can only be effective to the degree that, that the viruses that are circulating are going to be sort of knocked down by the vaccines. The more the viruses circulate, the more transmission there is, the more chance there is that there's a variant that actually develops that starts to have less impact by the vaccines. So now is the time to actually intensify all of the interventions that we have while the vaccines are rolling out to assure that these amazing products that we have now, the scientific achievements, actually can deliver the impact that they were designed to deliver.
Thank you.
I had just one sentence, and that is that if you're a healthcare worker in a country and the country is rolling out a vaccine, please take it. Don't compare and wait for something better to come along. A vaccine now is much better than waiting for something potentially that may come down the road after 6 months or a year. So anything that's being approved by WHO, that's being distributed by COVAX, that's available in the country or that's approved by a regulatory agency, and being made available, please do take it.
Thank you. I would like now to invite Catherine Fioncon-Bokonga to ask the next question. Catherine, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Fadela. Good afternoon to all of you. My question is regarding the surveillance and the collecting of the data. Is there a mechanism? Because Dr. Soumya Swaminathan spoke about it as her colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. That's such an important question. This is the first pandemic where I think we've had so much information on the virus and on immunity and on the science. I don't think there's any other virus that's been so well studied by so many scientific groups around the world. One of the really remarkable things have been the availability of genomic sequence data on this virus. Starting from the very beginning, on the 10th of January, we received the first genome sequences from Chinese scientists, which told us that this is a new virus closely related to SARS-CoV-1, but a completely new virus, and it was then later on named SARS-CoV-2. And now we have almost 500,000 whole genome sequences in public databases like GISAID, like GenBank, and there are thousands of scientists working around the world collaboratively to analyze these data. So from the beginning, we've been watching this virus, and we've learned, all viruses mutate or change, especially RNA viruses. Now, this particular virus actually has been changing or mutating much slower than other viruses like HIV, like flu. So in a way, that's been reassuring. We were tracking these changes right from the beginning. There was a mutation that appeared in February, March, the D614G, that quickly became predominant across the world, and there were early reports that it's much more transmissible. So this is a natural evolution of viruses, so we are not surprised. What is recently has been of concern, of course, is that some of these mutations in the spike protein are actually acting to prevent antibodies from binding as effectively to the virus. So the virus is able to get around the antibody and still go and bind to the cell receptor. But the scientists are tracking this, and they're finding ways of how we could change the vaccines as well as monoclonal antibodies and treatments. So we have, for the genome sequences, we have public databases, we have a very good system. I mentioned the virus evolution working group that WHO had set up in June last year that's been tracking this, and we work with all our partners. We work with CEPI, we work with this network of labs. We are now setting up also groups that will be able to periodically provide some guidance on the need for changes in the vaccine strain, similar to what we do for influenza. We have twice a year the advisory committee that informs which strain of flu should go into the vaccines for the following year. So maybe a similar mechanism is going to be needed for COVID-19, and we're already setting that up. In terms of data on other parameters, like the safety of vaccines, the efficacy, the effectiveness of vaccines, and the impact that the vaccines have in countries as they are rolled out, this is very important also, to do well-designed studies which can then also be fed up so that there's a platform and a database that's collecting all this data. So we have a meeting tomorrow that's going to discuss the various methods that countries should use to collect data, both from, going all the way from randomized trials of testing different vaccines in combination, or looking at different durations between the first and second dose, or looking at one dose versus, a delayed booster. There are different designs. And then observational cohort studies, as is happening in countries like Israel and the UK. We're learning as vaccines are being rolled out, and the impact on hospitalizations, the impact on transmission. As well as on the safety side, we're going to develop a platform that will collect active monitoring of people who are getting the vaccine, so that we keep learning about the
sowunothile njengaloku udiva leti njulabcopho daka Sage bamchazile ke ukuthi it's a strategic advisory group of experts lokusho ukuthi nase kukhulumela bo songcondvo laba sebahleli phasi bayibuka lenvo ba offerisha ke iadvice through yena WHO. Ngithemba ke mbukela uvilelo ukuthi wona lo mjovo AstraZeneca ngumjovo lekwamele ukuthi usebenze nangabe kumbe bonekutibuta noma kunekungabada noma kumbe utfola information lengasiyo ngoba lokunye lokuvele mbukeli ukuthi sisakhuluma yona lenzaba ya COVID-19 inzaba ye misinformation ingilenye lehluphako inyenti kakhulu information lekhona ngalomkhuhlane kodwa ke kuba kuhlelwe ukuthi nasitfole kulaba vele labathenjiwe ukuthi basebenta wona lo msebenzi ukuthi singancoba njani lo mkhuhlane bayakhuluma abodokotela ayakhuluma nema scientists ngicabanga ukuthi naye chair waka Sage uyibekile yakhe inzaba ukuthi leligciwane lesikhuluma ngalo leli liyagucugucuka lokusho ukuthi kude kumbe lo ngathi yena namhla uyathi lokuthi kusasa kutawende kanti lokusho ukuthi tikhona tinqumo letawuthathwa kuphinze kubuyelwe emuva tibuyeke leto tinqumo leto kuphinze kutfolakale kumbe lomunye umgubudla lekufanele kuhambe ngawo kusaliwa yona lempilena mbukeli ngingijoni mole ke ngithi bekumnanzi ngihlethi nawe sithathela kuyo le press conference siva nje ukuthi engabe tinjula bucopho tithini taba selangeni lakusasa isikhathi sesifana usale kahle.
ShopRite has always been here for you, and our promise to bring you low prices on what you need most will never change. Get 400 grams Right Brand peanut butter, only 20 emalangeni, and 500 grams Sunlight laundry soap, 2 for just 24 emalangeni, only at ShopRite.